we come now on to the second half of our evening's activities, titled From Ancient Parchment, an extended talk from one of our founders here at the MNPC, Rhys Jenkins. So we have our extended talk, A Greek Influenced by Grimm, H.P. Lovecraft's Classical Reception. Short bio, Rhys James Jenkins is a third-year PhD researcher and reception scholar based at the University of Birmingham. Rhys is active in fields that bridge classical reception studies, popular culture, the Gothic and American race relations, and his current project is in examining the racial and political implications of H.P. Lovecraft's classical reception, exploring Lovecraft's use of the classical within his xenophobic expressions. And with that, Rhys, I will hand over to you.
All right, cheers, David. Thank you very much. Hopefully everybody can hear me just fine. I'm going to share my screen now to PowerPoint. If people could, whoop, holler, or otherwise, just to indicate that they can actually see this, and then I'll go from the beginning.
Yep, we're seeing the slideshow, and I think if you, when that happens, all is well.
Fantastic, fantastic. All right. Well, it's very difficult to follow on from three such, rich and informed presentations earlier by the MMU Gothic Centre. Lots to unpack there. So yeah. So thank you very much for those. As David said, I'm Rhys. I'm a PhD English Lit at the University of Birmingham, where I also teach at the moment an undergraduate module called English in the World. I'm also the current director of the Midlands Network of Popular Culture. Now, before I get into my talk, I have to go through some housekeeping. I've got to say at the start of every single talk that I'm funded by the James Panter-Bedouin Foundation and the British government's Turing scheme, without whom my research could not be possible. So yeah, just got to get that stuff out of the way, the housekeeping. But in fact, I've just been selected by the Turing scheme as a grant recipient that will allow me to visit Providence, Rhode Island, and undertake archival research at Brown University, where I'll kind of have first-hand access to not only to Lovecraft's original letters and manuscripts, but also his birthplace, where he spent the majority of his life. So I'm very excited for that. Yeah, as for my background, I actually graduated from the Department of Classics, Ancient History and Archaeology at the University of Exeter as a reception scholar. And so we're going to start off by briefly covering what exactly reception studies entails for those unfamiliar, and how it links to Lovecraft's Greek period. This period, which kind of utilizes Daryl Schweizer's framework, spans from 1917 to 1923, which is the period of Lovecraft's life in which I have the greatest vested interest, due to his frequent expressions of admiration, really, for antiquity, and his utilization of classical themes and motifs in his works. I'll focus on one poem for the first half of my talk called To Greece 1917, followed by a sneak peek at a section of my thesis that involves some interesting interactions, let's say, between Lovecraft and T.S. Eliot. This kind of involves looking at two more poems that were written by Lovecraft in direct response to T.S. Eliot's modernist game changer, The Waste Land, which Lovecraft titled Waste Paper. That should already give you a clue as to what he thought of Eliot's writing, but let's keep it between ourselves for now and pretend to be excited later, shall we? And shocked and amazed. So yeah, so what is a reception scholar anyway, and what does it involve? Well, we look at the representation or use of antiquity in instances of modern culture. I avoid the use of the word appropriation as distinct from the broader overarching sphere of representation, because it can be quite problematic using that term. Put it bluntly, I engage with the provenance of reception studies through antiquity. Now you might be wondering why I have a copy of Stephen Fry's Mythos here. Well, note what it says at the bottom. It says Greek myths retold. Not told, they're retold. Stephen Fry, in writing this volume, has consulted many different versions of these stories from several different periods of time and from different cultures, even, in order to retell the Greek myths, as though ancient Greece was some kind of singular amorphous culture, when really it isn't. However, my point is he's engaging in the act of reception, or better or worse, by filtering this knowledge from many sources to create something new. Other products of classical reception include one of my favourite films, O Brother, Where Art Thou?, with Big Dan mirroring Polyphemus from Homer's Odyssey. The Coen brothers reframed Homer's narrative and sort of set it in America's deep south during the worst point of the Great Depression, which highlights issues ranging from race relations to even the flaws of capitalism. And classical reception can also be used to vilify another culture or race, such as in Frank Miller's 300, where the Middle East and punk culture are both villainized in the wake of 9/11 by warping a classical narrative to suit their political purposes. The reception scholars work to unpick these tangled narratives, to kind of understand where this new interpretation originated from, and see if our understanding of where it comes from shines greater light on the new material that's been created. So we can imagine the reception process as a chain, really, the first link touching the next and another and another. This is the most simplistic view of it, but I also like to think of it as a web, right? It's a web of reception. And it's in this kind of process that Lovecraft actively engages in throughout the entirety of his Greek period of poetry and prose. Which brings me nicely to the man himself. What business does a reception scholar have with Lovecraft? Well, in A Confession of Unfaith, Lovecraft shed light on his broader philosophical and theological stance, while reflecting on the influence that classical mythology had on his writings and on his worldview. Lovecraft himself credits the origins of his particular brand of existential horror to a synthesis of Greek imagery and Gothic macabre, referring to himself as a Greek influenced by Grimm's fairy tales and Poe. However, it is a sad fact that Lovecraft's poetry receives only a fraction of the attention that his short stories garner. On balance, for every one piece of Lovecraft's fiction in the spotlight, there are 7 of his poems awaiting inspection. They serve as a tragically untapped wealth of information, which my doctoral thesis begins to address. Curiously enough, one poem that is rarely ever highlighted in relation to Lovecraft's fascination with antiquity is To Greece, 1917, which concerns its political status at a turning point during the First World War. A thorough analysis of Lovecraft's Greek period, I have to say, is yet to be actualized. And that is what my thesis commences. This is exactly that. At its core, To Greece is a criticism of King Constantine I's actions as a foil for the later praising of Prime Minister Venizelos' attitude towards a liberated Greece, with the German forces and their allies pressing in. This is framed as a world-rending conflict between the Olympian gods and the Norse Aesir. So to understand Lovecraft's structuring here, we must actually look to Alexander Pope. He was responsible for one of the most popularized translations of Homer's Iliad, which held considerable influence throughout both the 18th and 19th centuries as the classic translation that was built on all the preceding versions. Pope's The Iliad of Homer from 1715 is written in iambic pentameter, featuring heroic couplets in Middle English, all mirrored in Lovecraft's To Greece. Lovecraft's opening call to "Ye sons of Greece" appears 3 times in Pope's translation within key monologues in Book 9. And above all else, the most convincing evidence that Lovecraft was inspired by Pope in the construction of this poem appears in Lovecraft's 1915 essay, The Allowable Rhyme, written no more than 2 years prior to Greece. This essay was dedicated to praising Pope's role in the English poetic tradition, voicing that, and I quote, "So far as English versification is concerned, Pope was the world and all the world was Pope." Joshi points out that Lovecraft's earliest surviving poem was an abridged retelling of Homer's Odyssey, the copyright page for which sported a 6-year-old Lovecraft attributing an acknowledgement to Pope's own Odyssey translation. Quite comical when you look at it firsthand. But this explicitly identifies Pope's poetry as a key creative stimulus, right? It's molded not only Lovecraft's writing style, but his broader views concerning the versification of the English language. So this complicates our reading of Lovecraft. It demonstrates that he isn't always drawing from the original source in a linear fashion. Rather, he's engaging with a version of antiquity Alexander Pope's version of antiquity that has been filtered down the chain of reception through countless translations and interpretations of linguistic nuance before eventually arriving at Pope. So Lovecraft, in effect, is inspired by one interpretation of a classical epic, which colours his own output. The structural parallels with Pope's earlier work relate specifically to Diomedes' rebuttal of Agamemnon's speech made by the ships in Book 9. Agamemnon is ready to give up the Trojan siege and return home, but Diomedes rebuffs him. Just like Diomedes, Lovecraft rallies the Greeks of the present by recounting images of a long-lost era epitomized by glory in this poem. And while the poem's opening shares more parallels with Agamemnon's speech, it's clear that Lovecraft is aligning himself squarely alongside Diomedes, the man of action, with regards to the overall sentiment being expressed. And both Diomedes and Lovecraft's rhetoric frame themselves as the moral authority on this turning point in history, and in doing so, he covertly offers up a commentary of his own personal values. We have to read between the lines here, see. So between his adoption of Diomedes' values and his emulation of Pope's form, his poetic form, it gives a firm impression that Lovecraft seeks to convey as convincing a message as possible to the modern Greeks during the First World War, while presenting himself as an all-knowing vates, or wise man. The authoritative nature of Lovecraft's poem is further emphasized by showcasing his expansive knowledge of classical figures, events, and conventions. Then Lovecraft implores the Greeks to once again become the spark that set the world ablaze, the same nation that snatched infant Europe from a Persian grave. Referring, of course, to their triumph in the Greco-Persian Wars. The Persian king Xerxes is later mentioned as having been forced into submission by the Greeks, prostrate in the dust. Prostrate even, wow, that's a very different word. Yet further great deeds of Grecian antiquity are evoked from their resilience at Thermopylae and later their victory at Salamis, for their stand-up marathon as well, and the laws and arts that matchless Athens built here. Lovecraft is kind of painting the picture of a once great civilization with the emphasis on once, as he expresses nostalgia for the fame and liberty of long ago. So now that the First World War has brought the Greeks to a crossroads, they have to follow the example of Diomedes, the man of action, and spurn a coward's peace by conjuring the true descent of their ancestry to stir the sleeping glories of pure land, or else passive to barbarian Wilhelm yield. Lovecraft, other than being very well read on key events in the history of ancient Greece, is going one step further. He's going to be utilizing these references to deliver a socio-political commentary. To Greece personifies the central powers as Norse figures of myth, the Grecians having to weather Thor and Woden's frost-mad sway. The Germanic identity is being inextricably linked to the Nordic past for a specific purpose. It's tailored here. By juxtaposing this with his invocation of the Greek pantheon in overcoming these sort of contemporary yet ancient forces, Lovecraft sows the visual in the minds of the audience that the current war, the First World War, will be the stage upon which the Olympians will clash with the Aesir for the fate of all Europe. Not only will combat be met in the mortal realm, but the divine sphere will likewise hold a heavy sway on the field of battle, akin to the manner in which both the mortal and immortal had vital parts to play in the Iliad. Lovecraft implores Zeus to scourge the martial scene against Woden, and Athena to soar above the phalanx of encroaching Thor, before he prophesies that Poseidon smites the dread serpent in the ocean lair. So should the Greeks triumph, the poet foresees that their victory will herald the return of the Olympians' godlike train, who will, quote, rule as of yore and haunt the groves again. Not only does this act of clairvoyance lend to Lovecraft's self-crafted role as the poem's vates, wise man, but provides further evidence towards the interpretation that the poet is attempting to emulate conventions associated with the epic tradition, tying the two things together. This portrayal of clashing cultures seems to contain the seeds of his later views as an ethnocentric monoculturalist. Now, that's a big phrase, but I'm going to break it down for you a little bit later. In January 1931, aged 41, he wrote to James F. Norton, I quote here, "No anthropologist of standing insists on the uniformly advanced evolution of the Nordic as compared with that of other Caucasian and Mongolian races. As a matter of fact, it is freely conceded that the Mediterranean race turns out a higher percentage of the aesthetically sensitive, and that the Semitic groups excel in sharp, precise intellection." Close quotation. I feel it's very important for me to add quotations, especially when quoting something as problematic and, starkly racist as that. And in the same letter, he then made an argument grounded in culture with no pretense of scientific basis, much like the views he'd expressed those many years ago in this same poem at 27 years old. To quote, "What then is the secret of pro-Nordicism amongst those who hold these views? Simply this, that ours is a Nordic culture, and that the roots of that culture are so inextricably tangled to ours that no other influences are fitted to mingle in our fabric. We won't despise the French in France or Quebec, but we don't want them grabbing our territory and creating foreign islands like Woonsocket and Fall River." Close quotation. So on the one hand, Lovecraft is not exactly advocating for racial segregation per se, but on the other, he's asserting that distinct cultures should maintain their distinctiveness. It's a really weird middle ground he's taking. He can't even justify it in his letters when questioned. He admits there's no scientific basis for it. By 1931, Lovecraft had openly admitted that scientifically there's no intrinsic biological difference between races and ethnicities. So instead, he falls back on the entirely non-scientific preservation of culture, which he'd expressed indirectly years earlier in To Greece. And as you probably appreciate, this is an intellectual position that differs greatly from the more linear, cut and dry forms of overt racism. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still unquestionably xenophobic and racist, but Lovecraft seems to have been drawing a line between his own personal discomfort being around people of different races, which he did not regard as requiring any justification beyond the purely emotional, and his objection to cultural dilution. It's really strange. So this belief, combined with a desire to maintain geographic distinctions between cultures, as expressed in such poems as Providence in 2000 AD and To Greece 1917, leads me to the conclusion that were we to classify Lovecraft's stance on culture and on race, it would be that of ethnocentric monoculturalism. But to draw from Jennifer Taylor's definition of the term, firstly, an ethnocentric individual values one's ethnic or cultural group over others. And secondly, monoculturalism refers to the belief in one's right culture. Quote there on right culture. To Lovecraft, while he admires the ancient Greeks and believes them to have been a glorious culture, he frames the Germanic Norse forces as mighty in raw strength and as master puppeteers who command their, quote, bestial cohorts. Further to his personification of the central powers as the Aesir, Lovecraft simultaneously demonizes Germany as a monstrous menace of an invading brood in the form of a crawling hydra, which naturally recalls the second labor of Heracles as he wrestles with the Linnaean hydra. Through bestializing Greeks' oppressors, then, a technique otherwise termed atrocity propaganda, which was a widespread wartime tactic in both ancient Greece and throughout the First World War, the opposing side is painted as a powerful threat, despite the inference that they are culturally and intellectually inferior themselves. Now, I don't believe that Lovecraft is stating a belief in German inferiority here, as this would directly clash with his pro-Nordicism. I think the more reasonable conclusion to draw is that Lovecraft is writing his own piece of atrocity propaganda to stir up the emotions of oppressed Greece, calling them to arms against a people who brought war to their doorstep. And this is done with the clear aim of evoking these kind of primal emotions of fear and hatred, and to lessen the difficulty of encouraging action by convincing the Greeks to shun neutrality and uniting against a mythologized, baser foe. So following my detailed analysis of To Greece, I have to conclude that Lovecraft harnesses his broad knowledge of the classical as a mode, as a vehicle, to convey a heavy socio-political commentary on the events of the First World War. He connects with the classical material on a number of levels through his extensive familiarity with multiple mythological icons and historical events. The poetic forms of those he admires comes into play too, as well as the conventions of epic poetry in a wider sense. Lovecraft supplements his pro-action message with wartime propaganda techniques through a classical lens. And by paying homage to the likes of Pope, Homer, and even Virgil as the Vates, the wise man, the poet inserts himself as a figure of authority whose final view is that of hope for a return to the golden age of Greece, and by extension to a more, and I quote, cultured and civilized world. Quotes there. Off the back of this, it may come as a surprise to some that H.P. Lovecraft, writer of horror and weird fiction, shared a lot in common with the modernist Helms poet T.S. Eliot. Lovecraft believes himself to be an ancient, behind the times in all things. And through his letters, he once created a persona in half jest, that of a Tory supporter and displaced subject of King George III. It's really quite an interesting read, if a bizarre one. Eliot was likewise a royalist of neoclassicist predilection. He dramatically announced as much in 1928 when he described himself as a classicist in literature, royalist in politics, and Anglo-Catholic in religion. So this can be evidenced up to a decade prior in one of his most influential essays called Tradition and the Individual Talent, 1919, during which he purported that a poet writes, I quote, with a feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer, and within it the whole of the literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. And Lovecraft actually expressed this very similar sentiment in his July 1923 issue of The Conservative, criticizing writers who might be steeped in the orthodox English literature of the middle 19th century, rather than immersed in the universal stream, which knows neither time nor country. It's quite a well-established fact that both Lovecraft and Eliot expressed very broadly racist views and xenophobic ideologies through their works and their personal letters both. So with these similarities in mind, and considering these numerous ideological overlaps, as we've just seen, how and why did Lovecraft rail so vehemently against Eliot's The Waste Land? Well, the title of Lovecraft's parodic response, Waste Paper, apart from being a degrading take on the wasteland, was formed after Eliot's sponsors called the work a poem of profound significance. It's by no means unintentionally ironic that the poem is prefaced by an obscure reference in ancient Greek, taken from the sole surviving fragment of an epigraph by Glaucon from the Palatine Anthology. The translation reads, and these are my translations, all is laughter, all is dust, all is nothing. So if we consider that Lovecraft received Eliot's mythologically and religiously resplendent The Wasteland as an ode to humanity's overstated importance within the universe, the irony becomes all too clear here. Waste Paper exposes the triviality of humanity's existence as being of no significance whatsoever in an infinite and purposeless cosmos. By evoking imagery of cosmic grandeur, Lovecraft's intention is to undermine both the wasteland and humanity's perceived significance, even within the first few lines. He opens on a fundamentally existential narrative, which is, we're no stranger to that, especially given our three previous talks today, which describe the Earth's naturally unnatural formation. The unpalatability of line 8 lends to the theme of the natural made unnatural, as our senses are twisted. Any pretense of regularity within this poem is completely dropped by line 10, which leads directly into the bulk of his modernist parody, wherein various aspects of human life are referenced. At first, these aspects seem like random examples, but are entirely intentional. For example, line 9 comically reduces the blazing planet and humanity's unending cycles, boiling the grandiose down to those of a bicycle in the night, going round and round. And instead of the illuminated darkness of space, the night of humanity is instead lit up by a dandy acetylene lantern that costs $3. Yeah, really grand, isn't it? So what Lovecraft's doing here, he's kind of playfully adopting the modernist stream of consciousness technique to undermine any notions of this universe existing for an ordained purpose, as these grandiose cosmic patterns are reduced, they're boiled down to their mundane counterparts. We actually see a lot of playfulness from Lovecraft during his personal correspondence. You don't necessarily get to see that in his short stories, or if you do, it's usually through the lens of outright racism. But here we do see a bit of playfulness regarding his philosophy rather than his racism. So this idea of the cosmic unnatural has come to characterize a lot of Lovecraft's famous works, with the unnatural generally represented by those timeless entities that kind of, they lie beyond the stars, or they slumber in the abyssal depths. But here, the inference is that humanity's own evolution through progressive strife is the unnatural element of our universe. We are the blight upon creation. Other trademark features of Lovecraftian horror can likewise be found in this section, including strange mutations of nature, shaped by unfathomable universal forces, and the idea of the natural being unnaturally forced to life. But to Lovecraft, our very existence is inherently chaotic and lacks any logic or consistency or divine providence. This sentiment is echoed in the poetic structure. It's chaos, it's abject chaos, and a message that undermines Eliot's Christian allegory at its most fundamental level. Lovecraft then is harnessing the imagery of waste in a multitude of ways relating to the human condition, from parodying Eliot's grandiose wasteland as waste paper, to representing humanity as a wasting disease that lays to waste our environment and ultimately ourselves. As the unnatural element in context, humanity's subsequent impact on the world is expressed throughout as an intrinsic juxtaposition to the natural order, despite being itself derived from nature. It's Lovecraft's sort of fusion of nihilism and this awareness, strange awareness of environmental impact, that leads to his existential parody of Eliot's modernist style and classical overtones. And as someone who, and I quote, never had the slightest shadow of belief in the supernatural, Lovecraft's poem is a criticism of Eliot, looking to religion and mythology for meaning in the face of meaninglessness, and conveying those ideals through his mismatched artistic medium. During the final section of the poem, the poetic voice attempts to reassert a semblance of structural order and rhyme to the poem, before just kind of giving up entirely. The ghoul-haunted woodland of Beer is a direct quotation from Edgar Allan Poe's Ulalume, written in 1840, I want to say 1846, no, 47, I think. Don't quote me on that. Lovecraft himself was a great admirer of this poem in particular, and it served as the kind of inspiration for the opening of another poem called Nemesis, written in 1918, only a year after To Greece that we looked at earlier. And this would go on to, he'd go on to quote this poem many more times during his life, most notably in his later work At the Mountain of Madness of 1931. And he juxtaposes the existence of what he considers to be Poe's poetic exemplum with the fact that one day Henry Fielding sat down to write the comic novel The History of Tom Jones, a Foundling. It's this kind of epic versus the micro. Who cares about the history of Tom Jones, the Foundling by Henry Fielding? So the comparison kind of implies that for every work of genius, there is a corresponding work that Lovecraft would be inclined to dismiss as abject lunacy. And it further emphasizes Lovecraft's argument that there is no use in attempting to impose any kind of preordained order onto a universe that is fundamentally chaotic in nature. And the poem ends on shanty, which echoes the conclusion of The Wasteland, actually. They use the same line in the conclusion of that as T.S. Eliot, albeit more literally here due to its use throughout the poem as a pun on shanty town. Aside from the inference that nobody is figuratively at home to either understand nor even listen to the poet's train of thought, this ending is a deliberately anticlimactic one, despite being nowhere near as ambiguous as the infamously puzzling ending to Eliot's The Wasteland. This line, shanty, 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 it's been debated by so many scholars all for so many years now. If you're not familiar with it, I do recommend just, if you want a deep dive at some point, just type in shanty, as I've spelt it in the PowerPoint there, shanty T.S. Eliot, and you're in for a world of confusion. So obtruse was this ending, actually, that Lovecraft took to using the word repeatedly in mock jest until the end of his life, either as an expression of exasperation in his letters or deliberately nonsensical as a closing remark. You know, he'd write to his contemporaries, you know, and if he'd been expressing some kind of niche viewpoint that he didn't feel like anybody was understanding, he'd end it saying, "Oh, shanty, shanty, shanty." It's again is this kind of playfulness that we don't usually get to see in Lovecraft's darker short stories, and it's really weird considering that my work, you know, focuses on exposing his racism, but not only that, looking at how he exercised his racism and his xenophobia through the lens of the classical. So it's really weird for me to find these little playful moments during his poetry, of all places. And this quirk of his, you know, his personal writing demonstrates that for all the irritation that The Wasteland caused Lovecraft, like the poem undoubtedly made a lasting impact on him. You don't keep quoting shanty, shanty, shanty for the rest of your life unless the poem made an impact on you. It was like it's like a bitter dichotomy that gnaws at his mind, and it gnaws at him as late as 1933. There's a letter to J. Vernon Shea where he quotes this yet again, but decided with hindsight that his parodic response on reflection, I'll quote here, sounds sadly flat today, now that the heat of combat has subsided, as though he ever considered himself like having a game of fisticuffs with T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot didn't, I doubt T.S. Eliot even knew that Lovecraft existed, to be fair. So it's quite comical that he always considered them to be in mortal combat, despite T.S. Eliot never once replying to him or addressing this poem in any way. It kind of tells you a little bit about his ego. But in 1935, 12 years after writing Waste Paper, Lovecraft would go on to co-author a short story with a young R.H. Barlow that we can and should interpret as his final rebuttal to Eliot's grand vision of the anthropocentric apocalypse. This largely undercirculated poem is best described as a cross between the part of H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, wherein the protagonist accelerates through time to the Earth's terrifying heat death, while also being a subversion of Olaf Stapledon's science fiction masterpiece, Last and First Men, 1930. Now, the title of Till All the Seas is derived from Robert Burns' love song, Red, Red Rose, from 1794. And he makes the choice to pen it for a tale about the final end of humanity, which is a kind of a doubly ironic one if you consider the lyrics to Red, Red Rose. So this short story tells of the planet's gradual and painstakingly slow demise at the hands of climate change, provoking a great eviction of man to the Earth's poles. Though humanity has, in its hubris, always considered itself nature's great adapter, they ultimately couldn't escape the shadows of change and doom brought about by the intensifying gaze of the sun. And so this story embodies our current arrogance and indifference towards climate change, as well as our ignorant disbelief of its apocalyptic repercussions. I quote, Each new generation of man was loath to believe what it heard from its parents, much like what's happening now. Split into two parts, the first deals with the events leading up to the end of the Anthropocene, and also sets the stage for the second half, during which the last human on Earth dies, pitifully and inconsequentially, in madness and filth. Yeah, great. But what of the genre of this story then? Aside from being an eco-gothic didactic, I think we can all agree on that. It's set in a science fiction landscape. It's set in the far-flung future. And it features many of the themes that characterize a grimdark setting. It's a dystopian short story set in the far future at the fringes of civilization, where society has aimlessly slid back towards barbarism. And degradation and debauchery become the commonplace once the governments of the world are disbanded. These are all met, all of these things, these aspects, kind of meet Adam Roberts' criteria for a classic grimdark environment. I think he wrote about it in 2014. If you search Adam Roberts grimdark, you'll come up with some papers on that. So Lovecraft's trademark nihilism and existential dread still permeate the tale. However, as the narrator of the first half of Till All the Seas describes how the sun swells to embrace the earth, as if the planet meant to return to that source whence it was snatched aeons ago through the accidents of cosmic growth, the evolution of humanity is characterized as no more than an accident, which is now being corrected. With these themes in mind, I assert that Till All the Seas is a squarely grimdark setting within an eco-gothic didactic. It incorporates elements of cosmic horror into its narrative, for which Lovecraft is arguably best known. Accompanying the debauchery and the amorality, doomsayers and those who preach a religious doctrine without any concrete evidence are executed as the non-existent gods fail to deliver their portents. If we read this story, and I think we should, as Lovecraft's final rebuttal to Eliot's The Wasteland, then this mass execution of religious fanatics, narrated through the prose as opposed to through poetry, should be read as a metaphor for Lovecraft's core issue with Eliot. And that is that Eliot's use of the poetic art form as a modernist vehicle to deliver a philosophical point is moot. In Lovecraft's mind, modernism, and using it through poetry, God forbids, should not and cannot accurately be used to deliver a philosophical point. He's effectively executing the meaningless illusion embodied by The Wasteland. Eliot portrays a world that is lost without religion, right, in The Wasteland. Most notably apparent in his description of a third figure who walks always beside you that neither traveller can recognize in the poem. I think that's in part 4. So Lovecraft's shift in perspective places the blame on religion as the stagnant falsehood that has restricted any hope of true progress in this world. And the loss, above all else, that is presented as the most terrifying thing, however, is the loss of culture. We're linking this back to Greece from earlier. It's the Western Hemisphere that falls first, after which the rest of the world soon follows suit, as though the Western world were holding up the rest of existence and civilized society in some way. And at the brink of humanity's demise, racial memory is forgotten, and the dead museums are rendered silent as the immemorial past was abandoned. This is the true horror of Till All the Seas. Humanity dies bearing no memories or legends of the old lost lands, implying that inspiration itself is dead. And the narrator then proceeds to position themselves, still after the last death of the death of the last human, as the all-knowing Vartes, this wise man, an omniscient observer of humanity's destruction, and the fact that the universe just keeps turning afterwards. So the intention here is twofold. First, it places the narrator in an untouchable position of superior knowledge. And second, it serves as an informed warning for the reader's generation to not ignore the signs of a gradually heating world. you don't usually connect Lovecraft with climate change messages, do you? It's not exactly the first thing that comes to mind, but here we have it. Um, the consequence for remaining passive to Lovecraft is seen in Ull's bitter end at the climax of Till All the Sea's second part. And as the last human on the globe, all the lands of the world are his, and all are equally useless, as he perishes in the most trivial, anticlimactic manner. The last human dies by accidentally falling into a slimy well whilst searching for water. Yeah, great end for humanity, that. So Till All the Seas concludes with the narrator summing up the empires and the civilizations that came before, and he's exasperated that nobody had realized sooner how titanically meaningless it had all been. A final note of existential nihilism leaves us with the image of the stars continuing to whir on for infinities unknown, marking the end of a negligible episode, the careless plan of eternity. So throughout this examination of Lovecraft's use of classical imagery and his attitude towards Eliot's The Wasteland, his points of critique have been reliably consistent, albeit begrudgingly given Eliot more respect as a philosopher rather than a poet as time went on. By utilizing Lovecraft's personal letters to illuminate the close readings of Rudis Indigestaque Moles, Waste Paper, and Till All the Seas, we've gained a more nuanced understanding of his personal doctrine on the function of ancient history, function of art, his own existential nihilism, and the role of these three in shaping his vision of a waste and the apocalypse in relation to the eco-Gothic. Thank you very much, Joachim. Oh, and if you're interested, I've got some sources here. I'm very happy to forward these sources to anybody who may be interested. But for now, I'll just zoom back this way.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Diolch yn fawr, Rhys.
Diolch.
And we will, let's start with because I've got certainly some questions here. If we've got about half an hour, 25 minutes or so left. So we'll focus a few direct questions and then maybe bring everybody in, go back to some of the questions from before. I think I just probably want to get a sense of I'm trying to get my head around still a lot of this.
Sure, no worries.
If you're exploring the unknown, then is what's happening with Lovecraft, I mean, not by any means of an excuse but by means of a literary device. If one's exploring the known, is what happens is that it's being set against the known, and for Lovecraft, what the known was Western antiquity.
Mm-hmm.
That's certainly what I kind of took away as an idea there, that the known was the framework of Western history and Western antiquity.
That's definitely what he implies, yeah.
Yeah. And so humanity dying, knowing no memory of the old things, which is what you imply there, is what we've got as that statement is. We're back to affect again, but is nostalgia and the idea of some kind of false nostalgia a point of affect in these poems for you?
I would say so, undoubtedly, because of Lovecraft's, I don't even want to say fascination, it's obsession with the past, with what he perceives to be the glory days of, golden age of Athens, and the Roman Empire, then the British Empire, and then, the colonization of America and the theft of Native American land. He frames all this as, a cultured act, which kind of boils my blood, especially as a Welshman. And yeah, it's not so much that he is fascinated by it, but he draws upon this nostalgia in a very targeted and specific way. as if to appeal to our sense of civility and our understanding of civilization. But what he seems to completely miss the mark on is that our understanding of civilization, even by his times, by his standards, really did not match up with what he was saying. I mean, even by his standards, at those standards at his time, he was, brutally racist, xenophobic. So by using nostalgia in this way, it does have those underlying that underlying motivation of almost like propaganda. Like I mentioned in the first part with To Greece 1917, it's almost as though he's designing his own historical propaganda. He's trying to paint the ancient past in this golden light, to which no other civilization on planet Earth can match in terms of cultural significance, or in terms of its figures, the figures that it's produced. Despite later on him saying that no, there's no scientific basis for my opinion. He said this in 1931. He was like, "There's no scientific basis for my opinion." I think there's a cultural basis for it, though. That was his attitude towards it, and it's so strange. Like over the course of his life, he does change his mind about a lot of topics, but he is just staunchly resistant to changing his views when it comes to the matter of race and Western races specifically. And it is quite problematic for me, as again I fully understand. Like I'm a white man reading these texts about another white man being racist as all heck, even to his peers, who at times would kind of try to gently challenge him in some ways. They recognized he was incredibly racist, but they tried to challenge him in various ways. But for me, because I share this love for classics and the ancient world, but what is fascinating to me is how he takes this and he molds the past around it to suit his political and social agenda. There's something quite insidious about it that I don't think many scholarly works related to Lovecraft have really explored to this point. And so I think you're absolutely right, and you've hit the nail on the head. The nostalgia for Lovecraft is definitely used as an affect. It's trying to mold our thoughts, trying to tug at our heartstrings in a really weird and warped way. And it's implying that the reader must be a cultured individual to, understand his messages and to understand his role in these poems as the wise man, this person who oversees everything. Hopefully that answers your question.
No, it absolutely does, and interesting to make alignments to certainly a lot of movements that seek to control the past and history that would align, but I think particularly at the minute with Putinism, because it is aligned so strongly to a pseudo-intellectualism. It's aligned so strongly to protection of literature and culture and architecture that is the thing that is framed as we will lose these old things if the West is allowed to prevail, or their terminology of the West or his. Again, just to come to everybody. Anybody else, please feel free to put hands up virtually, or again put some comments in there. I will bring back to the previous messages before. Just because I've got my notes here.
Yeah.
You talk about Lovecraft challenging modernism, or the idea of modernism and the idea that it should be broken, which certainly lines up strongly with this sense of affect and any kind of appeal to affect, which is going to sort of run roughshod over modernism. At the same time, if you've got a known bubble, boundary, unknown world outside, that is inherently a modernist structure to a degree. Is that what do you think is at the heart of some of this dissonance?
Oh, that's a really good point. I think Lovecraft's main issue with modernism is that as a poetic form, it addresses the wrong things. he is so staunch in his belief that the only true value you can get out of poetry is by emulating the poets of old, the poets that he grew up with as a kid. There's a quote I think I mentioned at the start of my my PowerPoint, that all the world was Poe and so on and so forth, for him as a child, and reading Grimm's fairy tales as well, and Alexander Pope's version of the Iliad. And so his fundamental issue is like, if you're trying to use modernist stream of thought, this very relaxed and free form of poetry, it's almost like you are not evoking the technical talent of who the poets that have come before. You are instead relying on niche, kitschy pop culture references, which to Lovecraft does not do at all. Despite the fact that, and this is another paper I'm working on, Lovecraft is expressing that it's okay in literature, not in poetry, in literature, to construct an artificial mythology for yourself. And he does that in his works of fiction, in his short stories, by referencing other works by other authors in his circles, right? Namely like the Eldritch Gods, the names of the Eldritch Gods and things like that. So it's fine to do it in prose, but if you do it in poetry, oh no, you can't get much value from that. That's just air. That's just you talking. You have to have some kind of technique. You have to have some kind of restraint. Otherwise, it's just easy. And I think that I think when we're talking about the modernist form and affect, that's his core issue with it. It's that it has no affect. The modernist stream of thought has no affect, but the past and the previous poetic forms do and should be used in a very specific way.
Almost sounds like Roger Scruton there. Oh dear.
A little bit.
Okay, and that brings us maybe to the point that Teresa was asking about before in the other panel. So if everybody else could come in as well, which is the idea of fluidity now comes in. The idea of the fluidity, possibly that affect brings. Certainly, that would be my interpretation, because it prevents any kind of modernist interpretation. Ultimately, our bodies react to things differently. We're all gonna have sensory responses that are fundamentally different from each other. And as such, this kind of breaks from any kind of uniformity in our relationship to literature, which contradicts any sense of group formality that he at the same time believes in. So yeah, I ask all four of you to sort of reflect on fluidity in the weird, and specifically in the work of Lovecraft.
I'll give the floor to the others first.
Well, Kate, you want to go?
Or can I?
No.
Sneak right in there.
Let's go in the order that we had that we went with. So we'll start with Kate.
The reason I'm sneaking in is because my entire thesis is essentially about generic fluidity and what that means, and if it means anything. And the answer is yes, it does, and no, it doesn't, in the way of all academic conclusions. But one of the really nice things about the weird when it interacts with, let's say, space horror, is I think you're entirely right, David, about that sort of having affect involved. And I think for at least contemporary horror set in space and which negotiates a bit with the weird, it's all about the body. It's all about bodies being ruptured, violated, exploding in gore and grossness. And it's all about how the body gets overtaken by, it's often things like parasites and bacteria is usually the old basic, the evil moon bacteria. But there is a sense that if we leave our environment, we will be subject and preyed upon by things that have evolved in ways we cannot comprehend and we cannot fight. And they truly do become the unknown at that point in regards to the sort of affective horror.
Like Colour Out of Space, you know?
Oh, fabulous. Yes, absolutely.
And links very much to what Frederick was talking about towards the end of his talk as well. Oliver?
I guess, so the idea of fluidity, at least the way that I'd understand it within my research, is looking at kind of how we've moved from weird to more new weird. I know that's a contentious label, new weird representations of, the weird has appeared. It's becoming more something we understand in everyday life. It's not that we have, I don't know, cosmic monstrosities in our everyday life or AI or anything like that, but more and more these terms are bandied about like, yeah, that could happen. It's more normalized as something that could potentially happen, rather than Lovecraft talking about, the environmental death of humanity. That's now just, that's going to be in 20 years' time. That's not a far-flung universe, end of civilization thing. So I think that this move to new weird is a sign of our problematic term, a lot of people's sort of embrace of that. I mean, we are no longer doing the I am legend. It's terrifying, the idea of having an entire new civilization. Now it's just, yeah, that's going to have to happen because we've confronted realities that mean, in a best case scenario, our entire civilization is going to change. In a worst case scenario, our entire civilization is either going to change or disappear. And I think that idea of, nostalgia is this kind of the idea. I'm fascinated by post-apocalyptic literature. So the idea of how nostalgia is used in those things, as opposed to it in new weird literature. I'm thinking Vandermeer's Annihilation, the Southern Reach trilogy. It's an apocalypse. It very much is. I mean, the apocalypse is a reference continually throughout it, but in the etymological term, it's an uncovering of something new rather than a destruction of everything and an end of everything, which I find fascinating. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on form in Till of the Seas versus other forms of sort of modernist or I guess postmodernist. I'm thinking like The Road, how form in that is all about like this kind of annihilation, funnily enough, of meaning, a sort of epistemological void that's given through form, which Lovecraft I don't think was aiming for. I think he was trying to make a point that we should avoid this and we should hang on to it. That's why I'm using this lovely old nostalgic form that we'll all love because we all love, white culture. So it'd be fascinating to talk more about that. But I know
it seems really contradictory to begin with. It's like him saying, nothing matters, everything is to the void anyway. Oh, but we should really care about, poetic structure. Like that is the jam.
It's chaos. Nothing means anything except this hierarchy that I'm going to set up on no evidence.
And I'm going to stress out and really nitpick over it. I'm going to, exactly. On the surface level, he's full of these contradictories, but I think much of it can be resolved by this kind of ethnocentric monoculturalism that I brought up, and then on the other hand, him saying that while everything is ultimately insignificant, there are things that can matter to us. There is no objective meaning, but there is subjective meaning,
which would be really reassuring if it wasn't, racism that he latched onto is the one thing worth hanging on to. God.
It kind of reminds me of Day After Tomorrow when they're in the library and there's that. I know it's one of your favorite films, Ollie, but there's that bit where essentially one of the people that's hiding from the improbably fast blizzard that's overtaken New York is like, we can't burn the Bible because if we burn the Bible, what's the point? And And then you have completely the opposite, where you got something like A Canticle for Leibowitz, which is quite a well-known sci-fi novel, which is about the world did end, and we know so little that our entire history has been rewritten into gibberish, essentially.
It's like, if we burn the Bible, we'll have dogs and cats living together. Mass hysteria. Really?
Dream. If they'd finally get along, we could have dog and cat people. Imagine it.
Oh, dangerous
But
territory.
we already have that in the eponymous cartoon, Cat Dog. So
Abominations both.
I will briefly checking in with Oliver to I'm assuming you're looking at Nebulous as well, and that's something that's not necessarily come up today, but the radio series Nebulous. In terms
I'm writing that down.
That's a Radio 4 comedy series from the mid to late 2000s. Mark Gatiss. It is a comedic post-apocalyptic sitcom. I think it had 3 series.
Wonderful.
Definitely very much in the line of everything that you've been talking about today.
I can't believe I missed that. I'm a big fan of Mark Gatiss as well. This is
yeah.
The League of Gentlemen, Mark Gatiss.
It's that very Mark Gatiss, yeah.
I don't know how I've missed this. That is incredible how that slipped past me.
I think that's definitely something to break. Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's got a lot of Night Vale. It's not overtly weird, but there are definitely elements, certainly, of that post-apocalyptic frameworks and the renegotiations of the relationship with the past is something that it plays on.
A really interesting one that also kind of aligns itself with the likes of Night Vale is Scarfolk, and that is almost like, it's if you're not familiar with Scarfolk, it is a town that is trapped in the past in the 1970s, a British town trapped in the past in the 1970s, and the happenings in this town, because of the fact they're stuck in the 1970s, is caught between nostalgia and historical weird, to the point where the fact it's trapped in the past creates its own Anthropocene, like self-contained Anthropocene. I'm going to send a link to it, actually, if I can send. It's a series of blogs, basically. It's a series of blog posts, and some of them are absolutely hilarious, and the others are just sort of depressingly. It's like Night Vale, but depressing, if you can imagine that.
Night Vale with Vaporite.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, it's like.
As you send those over rings, I am going to ask our oceanic specialist appropriately to talk about the fluidity.
Well, thank you. Well, I mean, I think this goes without saying that there's a lot of fluidity involved in oceanic research, but yeah, I think it is a great part of what I'm doing, because of course the substrate there is the ocean. Yeah, there's a wet ontologies that are now making their way. But I think one of the key points that I would try to convey in my thesis is the idea that not only when you think of Lovecraft, you think of in part you think of Cthulhu and other monsters like this. Even those that are not specifically, so Cthulhu, for example, is of the sea without being of the sea. He's supposed to be an alien and all that. But I would say very much that there's something very oceanic about the organicity, about the physicality of monsters, not even simply deep ones in the case of Shadow Winsmith, in all throughout Lovecraft. There's something very, like, the tentacle is very much an oceanic, it's very much part and parcel of this sort of oceanic idea. So when people like Neville and Luckhurst do say that, I think Neville says the tentacle is the appendage of this epoch, or the sense of the weird is very much, and the horror, contemporary horror is very much touched by the newly appendages that is the tentacle, and I think that relates directly to the oceanic in this regard. So I think there's a train of things being done this way, in culture that goes towards the oceanic. And a sense of fluidity as well, and fluidity in general in the weirds, not only on Lovecraft, but when I think of affirmation or macking, Great or Pan, which I recently in an oceanic novel saw a direct sort of comparison. I do, like, for anyone who likes that sort of weird oceanic, There's a great book called From the Wreck by Jane Rawson, came out a couple of years ago, about an alien underneath underneath the sea as well. And it's in a very sort of like shape-shifting, fluid being who at some point very much reenacts for very different purposes that famous sort of oozing, gooey transformation in Arthur Machen's Gregory Pan.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah.
Did you say that was Jane Rawson?
Yes.
Yeah, hang on, just drop a link. I just
Going up
to it there.
Thank you. I'm working on a paper on this or something because it's fascinating. I find
that's really cool. I want to pick up on one of the points you made was that the tentacles and stuff. It is obviously definitely super reminiscent of oceanic motifs and the kind of creatures that dwell within the deep. But the weird thing about creatures like Cthulhu is that it's caught between the known and the unknown, as described by Lovecraft. I think this is why, in the literature, if you looked at an eldritch entity, your brain does, like as humans, our brains do not know how to comprehend what we're seeing. So fundamentally, we go insane because we cannot and can never inherently comprehend what we're seeing. So this is why I believe that so many films that try to capture the essence of Lovecraft and similar weird fiction writers kind of falls flat on their face, because as soon as you put into a visual medium that which we are not supposed to and apparently cannot comprehend, well then it's like you've quantified it. There it is. Like, oh, it's not that scary. I'm not going crazy, but just by looking at it. And it defeats the point of it. It defeats the point of weird fiction, cosmic horror specifically, I want to say. Because if you can see it and you don't go mad, well, then where's the threat?
It's the big fading of colour out of space, isn't it? With Nicolas Cage going mental over what colour is it? It's pink, mate. It's pink.
Well, if I could jump in for a minute with that,
Yeah.
offer a somewhat indigenous perspective. If you look at, which, by the way, I'm a friend of Rhys's, so I'm sitting in America listening into this. But if I offer an indigenous lens, if you look at the cosmic horror that's oftentimes described, and I'm coming at this from a Gothic literature standpoint, so I studied that in college, you often see that things that are described as barbaric, horrific, and strange are often found as items of worship or totems in tribal culture. And it's kind of the same thing if you read through, which I have a lot of Lovecraft's thing. It's very interesting to consider the colonial lens of all of this, because he offers these strange eco-horror things as, oh no, here it comes. But we as people have been experiencing eco-horror ever since the colonial people came. So it's almost like a really weird dichotomy, because, it's like, here's this, but then we're over here going, hey, this has been happening ever since you started writing about it, sir, and then because of the Western centric lens that he focuses on, his take is slightly precedent over that which has already been there. And also, yeah, it's kind of ironic, really, because I'm thinking about, like someone mentioned oceanic things like tentacles, and I'm thinking of my Albanian culture worshiping the water and the tentacle things that are in it. So, if I came at a Lovecraft Cthulhu and I'm going, oh, you mean just another typical Tuesday? So it's just like it's kind of strange. I've always felt very strange reading Lovecraft because it's so layered with what you said he considered to be the norm, and then what he considered to be the other. But then you flip the script and you go, well, maybe you're actually the other and we're the norm. And so whenever I look at his literature, that's what I think about.
I'm always fascinated, I'm particularly fascinated at the moment with writers that are so particularly white middle-class American writers of the weird that are writing back against that. So Thomas Ligotti and Nicole Cushing in particular they've picked up on that particularly. They're fascinated by the philosophical ideas he's talking about, but realize that lens is just so inherently problematic. It's illogical. So
Right.
they flip it exactly around. So if you've read Thomas Ligotti's My Work Is Not Yet Done, it's a Lovecraftian horror tale, but it's about a corporate environment. It's about finding the horror of human civilization in what the developed company, the developed world of I think he wrote it in the 90s, considered the peak of Western society. So it's flipping that round. It's not about finding it in the non-white culture. It's about finding it in white culture. And I think it's interesting. I don't think it's perfect. I think there's still problems in it, because why is corporate environment the peak of any culture? I think people already are questioning that now.
It's the horror of the developed mundane, right?
Yeah,
it's taking the mundane, again, framing it as something developed, and then, like you said, flipping it on its head. They think, oh God, what have we made for ourselves?
Mm. Exactly. If I can, sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I know it's just in terms of the management of time, because we're at the limit. Obviously, I imagine we're all happy to continue for a little while because of the quality of discussion that we're having. I do want to bring in Francis, because Francis has made a couple of comments over the course of the evening and asked a question. I just want to bring their ideas to the table. So, firstly, just on the discussion that we just had, an example of what we've been discussing is Rita Indiana's Tentacle. Don't know if that's something that people have encountered, where Indiana turns Lovecraft's ocean horror on its head with Taino and Yoruba water ecological gods. And also to ask the question from before, which I've got a very brief discussion point on that also follows from the point that we've just heard from Enna, which is, what do people think about the rise of more earthy ocean and ecological cosmic horror in the more recent years in the big space horror films of the 2000s and 2010s? And I just want to bring in earthy and 2000 and the point that Enna's just made about switching things on its head and the colonial perspective, because one that I've always sort of played on is Ravenous a Lovecraftian or a weird film? Because I've always felt as though it is, even though I've never really come up with a really great reason as to why that might be. Where the manifest destiny, though, becomes the tentacles. You've got the long speech by Robert Carlyle's Colquhoun about manifest destiny, and this idea of the tentacles being both this curse, the cannibal curse, and the thing that it represents, which is the tentacles of manifest destiny and its philosophy and manifestation coming across. But yeah, more direct, the question of, I'll just go back up. What do people think about the rise of Earth, the Ocean, and ecological cosmic horror in the more recent years, in contrast to big space horror films of the 2010s? If anybody cares to take that.
Just on the space perspective, I think space doesn't mean what it used to. This isn't a sort of a nostalgic look back or, oh, space used to be so great, look what's happened now. But in that there's a lot of films from the 1950s and the 1960s that use space as this sort of idealized future that we can become a good species, or we can have value as a species once we transcend borders and we go into space. That Forbidden Planet spends a lot of time saying that the reason that as a society we've gone to space is because we've managed to overcome our baser instincts to greed and war and violence and lust. Whereas I don't think space means that anymore. It's not an arena that offers any sort of transcendence. If anything, I think it offers this sort of really quite navel-gazy introspection.
As with Astra, yeah.
Yeah, they're like thinking about Astra, like they're very good films and they're very interesting, but I think Ad Astra and First Man and Moon take one sad white male character and throw his problems large upon the blank canvas of space. The space doesn't really do anything in that area other than be an area where he has to deal with his own emotional issues. So I don't think there's any of that optimism, and I think that might be why we're turning towards the oceanic and the earthlies, because space has in some ways lost the potentiality it used to have.
And I think more very importantly, because we realize that there's a problem here on Earth, and we need to get going on this one. And I think just the fact that climate change and global weirding, some call it, is very much happening, and so we can't look at the stars really anymore at this moment. So we turn back to what we're afraid of, because it's always about anxieties and fears, and again the oceanic and the earthly. This cascade and constellations of climate issues just come back to the fore in this regard.
There's also that great short story by, is it Mariana Enriquez, in Things We Lost in the Fire, and it's a Lovecraftian short story set in Argentina. But I mean, spoilers. It's a Lovecraftian story, so I shouldn't have to explain the plot. But there's an eldritch monstrosity in the river that's beneath the chemical plant that's been polluting the river in a favela, and it's all the waste products from humanity that pollute the water and create the eldritch monstrosity underneath it. So even when you're bringing in like overt references to cosmic beings, to space in a way, it's becoming more earthly anyway. And I guess Jeff Vandermeer is probably going to be the epitome of that with the Bourne books and the Southern Reach trilogy. It's cosmic, but it's almost breaking down that boundary between cosmic and earthly. Depends what you mean by earthly.
It goes back to that kind of natural being the unnatural, being born from the unnatural, and it's actually kind of woeful how underrepresented female weird fiction authors are. Not just in scholarly works, but across the board in general, because there's some fantastic ideas, and all we tend to, I mean, I'm guilty of this as well. I talk about Lovecraft, right? Another white guy, and it's genuinely like it was only I think about 6 months ago I was at a conference down in Falmouth. It was the Dark Economies conference. And somebody pointed this out to me, and I felt ashamed of myself that I hadn't noticed this, really before. That there's so much volumes written for male weird fiction authors over the years, and yet if you were to compare that to the scholarship on female or non-binary weird fiction authors, then it's just practically non-existent. It's sad, but that's starting to change. I'm really glad they're starting to change, because there are some amazing untapped ideas here that are gold mines for discussion.
Absolutely. If I can react to that again, I think what I'm looking at because I'm looking at sort of post-colonial weird fiction with the oceanic, and that's where you find overwhelmingly female, black and brown, queer authors are doing an amazing job. And I think that the fact that we don't see this, of course, it's a of course, in academia, you see that scholarship being done. But I think in the next 5-10 years, we'll see a lot more of that, which is great. Because it's overwhelming how many authors now that are not people like me, gladly, and that just go and subverts what Lovecraft wrote, and also to go back to what Ernest we said was really interesting, is that not only is they're not simply subverting something that he created. He's part of a puzzle, and there's been many things before him as well, and they're just going back to also to other things that were before him, and to their critiquing life that is not simply his creation, even though he has influenced a lot of literature and horror, cinema, of course, but those things were already there, and they are tapping things and saying, well, again, it's not simply Lovecraft, or it's not simply white authors in the weird, but those are from other parts of the world, other people, and not only subverting and challenging him, but also simply adding this as well. I'm not expressing myself superbly there, but I think hopefully you get what I mean.
I think you'd really like this other research network, Frederick, and perhaps other people would be interested as well. But it's Haunted Shores, partly based in the Midlands and partly based down in Cornwall. And they, again, like you were just saying, they have some fantastic readings exactly like this, where they don't just look at white-centric or male-centric accounts. But Haunted Shores, they're great. They explore all kinds across the spectrum. It's fantastic.
Absolutely, they're amazing, and they have a conference on the 20th of May,
Yes.
where I'll be speaking very humbly, but a lot of others as well. And I do invite everyone to join us. It's a fantastic network. Thank you, Rhys. It's awesome. Please.
Francis has just said in the chat as well that they'll be speaking at the conference as well. So on seaweed, no less. So that's very interesting.
Francis also mentioned Silvia Moreno Garcia's Mexican Gothic, which is a fabulous call on weird and mushroom fiction.
Right. Everyone, I can't help but notice that it is now 10 minutes past our deadline time, and so it falls to me sadly to draw this to a close. Thank you to everyone who has spoken today. Thank you for everybody who has joined us. Thank you for everybody who's contributed to the chat and brought questions, and to all of the MMU crew and to the Gothic Centre there. I clearly need to spend much more time interacting with you folks, and to Rhys for a fantastic extended talk. I've enjoyed the evening greatly. I hope, and you seem to have, everybody seems to have gone there. We've had pretty consistent numbers throughout an engagement, and yes, so I will pass on to Rhys as director to completely conclude once we're done, but I just want to sign off with a great thanks. Please do come along to our next event, which will be about ludic subcultures. I'll be discussing particularly the haunt industry and the way that ludic subculture parallels the volunteerism and the potential exploitation that exists within industries that exist in hybrids between fandom and industry. And we'll get some industry engagement there as well. Rhys, do you have anything that you would like to finish up with?
Yeah, thanks everybody. Again, just echo David, but David's worked really hard on organising not just this symposium, but the next one that's coming up, like you just said. And we've actually got positions open on the committee at the moment. We're coming into that time of year where we are changing over the committee. I am just going to post in the chat the link to the committee application at the bottom there. If you are interested in taking part with the Midlands Popular Culture and with these kinds of conferences as well, please do put your applications in. We would value your engagement with the committee, and we'd love to welcome new people on board. We're a very inclusive committee, and we explore all kinds of the whole spectrum of popular culture, from academic viewpoints to industry panelists who have gone from academia into the breadths of the real world, so to speak. But yeah, thank you very much, everybody. I think let me have a look here. Yeah, we've got the Twitter link for Gothic MMU as well. And yeah, I'd just like to thank you all once again. The recording of this will be up within the next few weeks as well. So if you have friends who weren't able to come today, then it will be available. We'll be hosting it on our website.
It sounded like you were going to stop with "if you have friends."
If you have friends, share it with them, please.
Thank you very much, everyone. See you again soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys.